All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jim Jansen. I'm being joined here today with Allan Vyhnalek. We are not in our office today. We're actually in Lyons, Nebraska, broadcasting live. We'll be doing a land management meeting here starting for this afternoon. So bear with us with the sound. We're trying to give you the best quality given the internet that we're working off of. Today's meeting is going to be two parts. I'll be covering the first portion. Allan will be covering the second. And we also had some questions sent in that we'll be reviewing as part of the webinar. If you have questions as we're going along, we have Ryan Evans, our media specialist here at the university, joining us. If you want to know where something is on a website, type it into the little chat page. He's pretty good about watching it and putting a response in. You can also type in questions either into the chat or the question pane. And we'll probably hold into the meeting. And depending on what the question is, Allan and I will be answering those as we're going along. Allan's sitting right here to my right, but we're using just one laptop here to broadcast. So bear with us if you have any issues with the sound. I'm trying to talk in a sound that or at a level people could hopefully understand me from. Okay, so first off, my name is Jim Jansen. We have Allan Vyhnalek. He's our farm succession transition educator here at the university. If you'd like to reach out to us, our contact information is found on this slide. We can also have our information we'll be talking about today, which is going to be featured on the bottom part of this website. Both of our websites are under the web banner of cap.unl.edu. So please take a look at that if you need any information from there. The other thing I wanted to point out, Ethan Sorensen with Next Ag Appraisal and Realty out of Lincoln, Nebraska, was willing to be our sponsor for today's meeting. Ethan works in areas of farm management as well as appraisal. We greatly thank him for helping support this webinar and the related outreach we do here at the university. I believe Ethan works in areas of farm management and appraisal in Southeast Nebraska, parts of Missouri, Western Missouri, as well as Northeast Kansas. So if you need anything there, please reach out to Ethan. We'll have his contact information one more time at the end of the presentation, but we greatly appreciate his support for this webinar. So a brief overview of what we're covering today. We're in February already. It just seems like the first year wasn't too long ago. Today's topic, what we're going to be covering is where can we find current information on cash rental rates? How do we figure out a cash rental rate if you know what a certain price of a commodity should be, or if you have an inclination on what the cost of production is? How do we figure out a cash rent from that? Second part, Allan will be covering basically an update on what do we need to be aware of when it comes to lease arrangements, good practices for leases. And then finally, once again, we'll be doing our Q&A. If you have questions, we had a couple submitted. They are good ones. I tried to prepare, Allan did as well, prepare some responses. And going into the future, if you'd like to have one of your questions featured, send it in and we'll either address it as we're covering our presentation or we'll cover it at the end of the slide set. So the first piece here on cash rental rates, when we talk about cash rental rates, sometimes you have to take a step back. And what I've been telling people in 2023, everyone wants to know what the current 2023 rates are. And we're actively compiling data and we'll be producing our estimates here on March 15th. But I encourage you as someone, regardless if you're a landlord or a tenant, take a step back and ask yourself, where has cash rents been in 22? Did you see any changes from 21 into 22? Based on what those changes were, you might see some differences leading into 23. First piece here, the University of Nebraska does an annual survey on people in the land industry. From that, we do two different things. We publish what is called the preliminary estimates, typically in the middle of March. And then the final report is published in June. With that, once again, if you find the CAP website, that cap.unl.edu/real estate, you can actually find our most recent real estate publications and what we call the preliminary estimates. Those will be published as part of this outreach on March 15th, which I believe is Wednesday of that week. So keep an eye out for that and sit back and kind of think about where you've been in 22 before you head to 23. Few things I just wanted to highlight on the cropland and grazing land sides. On this slide here, you give a pretty good breakdown on the cash rental rates for dryland, cropland in 22. And I would ask each and every one of you, if I sit across the table from you and trying to coach you on how do we work through these things, I would ask you the question, Okay, if you're broadcasting from the East District today, where does your cash rent align on that range that we see on the screen here from what we call the high grade to the low grade and the overall average? The high grade is actually the average of the upper third, the low grade is low, and the overall average is the response that we've seen there. If you're sitting on the upper end of this information already, given whatever area you're in, I don't know what kind of change you would see into 23. What I can coach you on to think about is, how has your cash rent been in recent years? You may have heard people not having a lot of increase. Maybe they are having an increase for 23. Well, depending on what that increase is probably going to be influenced by the fact of where you've been in the prior years. So you think of these numbers, yes, they are for 22, but think of them as a benchmark. You have to know where you've been to know where you're. On the irrigated cash rents that we see here, we have a breakdown once again by the 8 major regions, which are called agricultural statistic districts, or more commonly, the crop reporting districts. The center pivot rates in the University of Nebraska, if you find our real estate report, you can also find the gravity or flood irrigated rates. In either case, it assumes that the landlord owns the entire irrigation system. So you're talking pivot, pump, power unit, power system. If the tenant provides one of those components, you would discount the cash rent to reflect the fact, okay, if the landlord isn't the one that owns a pivot, they would not have to carry the insurance. They wouldn't be responsible for those kind of things, whatever the case might be. Also, on the power units, you could discount the rent as well to reflect that. And this is a question we're actually surveying for 2023 as part of our special features section. So keep an eye out for that in June when we publish that information. On the grazing land side, you can either rent by the acre or by the pair. Some people rent by the day, animal unit, whatever the case might be. More commonly, the university talks about a per acre, and I happen to be featuring on this slide the per pair per month rate. So let's look at the central district as just an easy example. You notice here in the central district, the average cash rent reported was $61.45 a pair. That's for one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season. So say, for example, if the average was 60 times 5 is 300. And I know it's a little more than 300. What influences cash rents? And I failed to cover this on the cropland slides, and I'll jump back to the cropland here for a second. We have the dryland cropland on this slide. What is influencing cash rents in 2022 or 2023? Well, without a doubt, quality of the land, configuration of the property. Do you have a nice square field? Is it a field that is cut up by a ditch or a terrace or other features to the property that make it a little bit more difficult to farm? Where are you located at in Nebraska? Depending on where you're at, that's definitely going to influence the cash rents. On the irrigated side, all the dryland things I just mentioned influence the cash rental rates. In addition to that, we'll talk about is water availability. Different areas of the state of Nebraska are governed in different ways by the local water authority. And some of the policies that have been put forward in 2020, late in 23, late in 2022, impacting us here in 2023, the 2023 growing season. Regardless if you're a landlord or tenant, make sure you understand what your water rights are for this upcoming year. If there's any limitations, any appropriation changes in your area, make sure you understand what those are. And also make sure to understand how those policies may affect your lease. And do you account for that in your lease? Allan will be, this is queuing Allan's talk up, but how do you account for a shortfall in rainfall or whatever the question might be? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I know that's a point that I would hope you would address as part of your lease arrangement. Okay, so with that, we'll move here just briefly to the cow-calf pair rental rates. Once again, all those things on the productivity of the land, rainfall, configuration of the property. On grazing land, I don't care if you rent by the acre, the day, the week, the month, whatever unit you want. The one comment I would make is make sure you have a cash rent that both parties understand. And what is somebody willing to write that check out for? What is someone willing to receive it for? On the quality of the grazing land, the considerations for 23. Who's maintaining the fences? Allan will probably mention this in his slides. And who's taking care of noxious weeds, cedar trees, brush, thistles, other unwanted plants? Those things are all negotiable. I'm not going to get into that so much. And also on the quality of the land, you have a property that, yes, it has some nice shade trees out there, but it's not being overgrown by undesirable brush. Or I'm from Cedar County. Cedar trees is a very common occurrence there. Left unchecked, those are definitely things that are going to influence the cash rental rates. But if you keep up on them, they're definitely a feature, is something that you take care of the property, it definitely will take care of you. So just keep that in mind. Next thing here, I wanted to point this out, and I know this is a fairly common thing, but this is an updated slide. When it comes to the cash rental rates, in addition to the University of Nebraska, we also have the USDA rates. And the USDA rates are on a per county basis. And the breakout that we have here is for the 2022 year, 2022 reporting year. The USDA typically publishes this information in odd numbered years, but they happen to do it in the 2022. So with that, I'll feature some of this information here. And today's presentation is being recorded. It'll be archived, and I believe Brian Evans or me specialist will be sending out the website where you can find my actual slides, and take a look at this link that we got on here if you'd like to find additional information. So the breakdown that we have here, this is the 2022 county level cash rental rate reported by the USDA, National Agricultural Statistics Service. They do a survey that is a representative of farmers and ranchers across Nebraska. Their survey is done a little bit later in the growing season than what our survey is. And with that being said, they summarize by county. And you'll notice by county in here, some counties are in white. If they're in white, they're reflective of an area that they don't maybe have a lot of dry land, cropland out in the sandhills, for example. The reason Allan and I talk about this slide, though, is if you think back to the two prior slides here, okay, we have a breakdown by region. This regional stuff is estimated typically in the middle of March. This information is estimated in September. With that being said, you can think of this as your cookie. So let's pick on the central district here. It seems to me maybe some of the higher cash rental rates tend to be kind of in that Platte Valley I-80 corridor. Maybe some of the lower cash rents, maybe the lower thirds in Custer County, and maybe Group Valley and Greeley and Dawson, maybe those are closer to the middle. Think of this as a cookie cutter to give some ideas on, okay, how do these cash rents for dry land, cropland, for example, how does your county stack up in that range? And that's why we present that information, is to give you some ideas on how do we compare, how do we evaluate some of these things. In addition to the dry land, cropland rental rate, the USDA also reports on the irrigated cash rents. The irrigated cash rents are once again are on a per acre basis. And the USDA does not discriminate or define. When I say discriminate, I mean they do not divide out the center pivot from the gravity or the flood irrigated rate. So if you're, say, here in Buffalo County, this is an area I'm just aware, I don't know how many acres they exactly have that are irrigated, but there's still a fair number that are gravity or flood irrigated. Here in Buffalo County, that's in an area where the cash rental rate would be reflective of, let's say, a third of the ground. If it's flood irrigated on the irrigation side, the flood irrigated rate would reflect into this weighted average to account for just not the flood irrigated, but the gravity irrigated as well. According to UNL's numbers, University of Nebraska Lincoln's numbers, gravity or flood irrigation tends to rent somewhere around $30 to $50 an acre less than what the center pivot does. And the USDA also reports on a grazing land cash rental rate per acre. You'll notice certain counties in here, Douglas and Sarpy, there's obviously not a lot of grazing land in that heavy metro area. And also there's areas on the sandhill, if they can't get enough responses, they can't produce a number with confidence. And you can really see how the stocking rate, quality of the land, rainfall, competitiveness of the area, how that all greatly varies across the state. You can go from, the low teens in Southwest Nebraska to the, 60, 80, some of the much higher numbers in the Northeast. So just be aware of that. One other thing I wanted to point out, a little bit of an update here. If you are in the mode of doing taxes right now, be sure to be aware that in the state of Nebraska, we have a small income tax credit rebate that as a landowner in the state, if you're filing taxes, you can get rebate on a portion of your real estate taxes if you own ag land or a residential home. And this credit this year, you can find this on the governor's website. This is where I found this article I'm talking about here, where I took a few snippets out. The credit now applies to K through 12 plus your local community college, where your whatever district your property sits in. And the credit is going to be rising from 25 to 30%. So it definitely, it's not 30% of your overall tax burden. It's 30% of the portion of the real estate tax that goes to the local public school, as well as the community college. And I think Farm Bureau has a good website on this too. You can find some stuff on the Department of Revenue for the state of Nebraska. Just take a look at it. If you don't do your taxes, whoever you do your taxes with, make sure they're aware of this. You'll probably need to see your annual assessment you get in the mail in, say, August. Those are the kind of things that they're going to, or excuse me, in December. Those are the kind of things they'll need to see. All right, I'm just going to wrap it up here, and then we'll have Allan get switched over. 2 or 3 different ideas on how to figure out cash rents. First idea. Let's say you're in a county, the average cash rent rate, if you look at the USDA information, is maybe $190 an acre. And the average county corn yield, maybe you talk to a crop insurance agent or someone of that nature, you figured out the average county corn yield is 134 bushel. If you take the county rent divided by the county corn yield, that gives us what is called the county rent per bushel. The county rent per bushel, what that is for every bushel of grain produced on rented land, $1.42 of the sale price is going towards what? It's going towards the county, going towards the cash rent on these properties. $1.42 here, slide it to the upper right-hand corner. And in addition to that, let's say my property, it typically yields 119 bushel. If I take $1.42 per bushel times 119 bushel per acre, that gives us the farm level cash rent. We're taking what we know at the regional level, and we're stepping it down to the farm. You can plug in whatever numbers you want in here. This is just one example of adjusting the information to account for some of these differences that we have on the quality of the land. The other example, and I think Allan might like this example, kind of buy into it as well. We have what is called the cash equivalent from crop share. What the cash equivalent from crop share represents is if you were on a crop share, maybe the landowner, the landlord, really just wanted a cash rent, how do you estimate a cash rent from the crop share? So this example, this property actually yields 140 bushel, and we're going to do a 50-50 cash equivalent from share. So what we did on this slide is the landowner gets half of the crop, the tenant gets the other half. I'm using $5.90 a bushel, which I think is going to be pretty close to the planting time price guarantee with crop insurance, something in that neighborhood, around $5.90. And I took a 2022 crop budget, took half of the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses, added another 20% over what the 2022 prices were. And I'm using half of that right here. And this gives us the estimated how much a landlord would make per acre if they did a crop share, or what you might consider for cash rent if you were doing cash equivalent from share. And I used $5.90 to start with, and let's say it gets dry this summer and it jumps up to $6.30, and then things come down a little bit after harvest gets started. This just goes to show you, while expenses, once you pay for them, they're basically locked in. The yield, I did not vary the yield, but the yield and the prices definitely can fluctuate. So keep that in mind. What is the most reflective cash rent? Well, it varies depending on when you set it, and you have to use the best information you have available to hopefully figure those things out. Okay. Next thing here, some people might have a small, large or smaller parcel of odd-shaped piece of ground. Maybe you put it in this grass hay, cut it once or twice a year for hay. Let's say this field yielded 2.5 tons per acre of grass hay. A third of that was going to the landlord under a 1 or 2/3 split, or half of it goes under a 50-50 split. Under the 50-50 split, the tenant threw out, let's say, $50 worth of nitrogen on the property. If that's the case, they're going to pay half the seed, fertilizer, or chemical expense. This just goes to show you, if you can know roughly what this ground is going to yield or what you think the hay prices should be, you're asking yourself the question, if the tenant would buy out the landlord's share of the hay, what that would be worth. Well, that'd be one way to estimate on what the property could potentially rent for. Okay, so with that, that wraps up my section. I'm gonna move to the side here. We don't have the greatest setup, but I'm gonna move to the side. I'll join Allan after he gets through his slides. And I know there's a few questions that came in. We'll look at the questions when Allan gets through his information, and then we'll kind of back out. So we'll both be in the picture here. So.
All right, here we go. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Glad to have you. So many people on. It's amazing to see this crowd that we have on today, and we're happy to have you. One thing I wanted to mention is Jim said we're in Lyons, Nebraska for this, and we are. And so if you're in the Northeast Nebraska area, and you want to come to the meeting this afternoon, it's 1 o'clock in the community center, downtown Lyons, right behind the city hall. Please feel free to come, and we'd love to have you join our crowd. That'd be awesome. We think that's going to be cool. Okay, my comments about this. So first of all, please have a written lease. It's not your grandpa's farm anymore where we can just have a handshake or verbal agreement and assume everything's going to be all right. You know, I remember talking to one old guy after a meeting, and he said, I don't agree with that written lease stuff, but in our generation, our word is our bond. And he's right. And for boomers and the people older than the boomers, the word is your bond. But at the end of the day, what happens when those people are gone? What happens if they pass? What happens if they get hurt and they can't answer for themselves? Who knows the ins and outs of the leases? And so please have things written down so that whoever has to take over, whenever that happens to be, can get that done properly. If you have those handshake or verbal agreements, please get rid of them. Please get the termination notice sent. And that's supposed to be done by September 1st, the previous year. So lease is starting on March 1st in a couple of weeks here. Actually had to be terminated by last September 1st in order for them to be terminated for the 23 crop season. So just know that if you need to get rid of a handshake or verbal agreement, get that done before September 1st of 23 to start the new lease on March 1st, 24. And also wanted to mention that a bill was introduced in the legislature this year, LB 591, that would change the lease termination notice date. And the proposal in that bill would be to change it from September 1st to January 1st, meaning that to end a 23 lease, you'd have to get that done by January 1st instead of September 1st. So please watch for that. And if you have comment, please let your senator know. I don't think it's been through committee yet. I know it's been introduced. I think that's all the further it's gotten to this point. At least when I looked at it last Thursday or Friday, it had not gone to a committee yet. I think that there's advantages both ways. I'm not trying to advocate for or against the change in the law, but I will tell you what I think about the advantages either way. The advantage for changing it to January 1st is it primarily would help the landowner, give them some more flexibility in when they start or end a lease, to give them a few more months until they could end a lease with a tenant and get somebody else in place. The disadvantage is if the landowner, for instance, goes to Arizona for the winter time, then they'd really need to get that set up before they head down. But there's a clear disadvantage for the tenants, because in my view, the tenants use a lot of fall pricing for seed and fertilizer and fuel and all their inputs. They do that in the fall. And if I know I'm farming a quarter or a half section or something like that, I'm going to buy inputs for it, because that's when I get my cash discounts, my big discounts from the companies. And I would hate the idea of making the purchase of all those inputs and then have the landlord terminate the lease on December 31st and already have that stuff done. So please just be aware of that. I'm not trying to advocate that it should be changed or shouldn't be changed. I'm just trying to tell you what I think as I look at that bill from what I know about it. Okay. And then also know that aglease101.org is the website you go to pull up some cash lease forms. Here's what that looks like. And you go up in the upper right-hand corner of that main page and you get the document, look under the document library tab. And then that takes you to where the forms are at. And on the right-hand side of the forms is a fillable lease form information. That's the form, PDF forms you could fill out online and print and have a lease. On the left side is the are additional publications, additional information about leasing, and it's very well done, very good site. So please please use that if that helps you very much. We don't have written leases that we provide. We provide this form for you to kind of work through and work from. Okay, let's go on. Some critical things to think about for 23 are things I think about that we should talk about. It may be too late to terminate the lease, right? Because we have some termination notices in effect, maybe. But in February, some parties haven't set the lease rate yet. So this can remain a discussion point. The reason I know that is because in February, I know the Jim reports and I report that people are still negotiating what the lease rate should be. So, but I would suggest that you look carefully at the fall prices for crops when you're looking at this, because right now you can get, if you go to an ethanol plant or a processing plant with your corn or soybeans, you're looking at a much different rate or price than if you're going in the fall. In the fall, for instance, we're down under $6 for corn at most places for local, especially for local elevators. Beans are a decent price, but corn is not. I mean, corn's lower relatively to where it was last year. So you make sure you make your decisions based on fall pricing, for the 23 crop, rather than what you see for the 22 crop that's still in the bin. So, but more importantly, I think that when you think about a lease, please understand that we only have the ground for a little while, and it's our job as owners of the ground and stewards of the ground to take care of it for the next generation, because I think the next generation is still going to need it for food production for the world. So think about doing the right thing for the property in terms of conservation, managing weeds, insect disease pressures, maintaining or improving fertility, because should be our major objective. If I'm a landowner, and believe me, I am, I want that ground to be in good shape or better than it was when I got it from my parents. And I want that to be better for the future, whoever has it after I'm gone. And so I think that's more important than the price. If you're doing it for the money, man, you go make a different investment. Sell the land. It's worth a lot of money right now. Do a 1031 exchange, do what you got to do, make that work, and do it for the right reasons. But I'm trying to encourage people to do this for the right reasons. And that would be to make the ground better for the next generation to use and make it more productive. Some other things I think about is when we're going to set up timing of lease payments. Okay, so I don't know that we have a slide on it this time, but I would just submit that maybe I think it's coming up later. But I lived in one neighborhood when I lived in Iowa where all the cash lease money was paid in before March 1st, before the lease started. I don't necessarily recommend that, especially with higher interest rates. It makes the producer, the tenant, borrow some more money typically. And so that could be a bit of a problem. I also think about, so setting up the timing so that it's either paid half and half, or the old wheat, the old crop share leases where you had wheat in place, or you had wheat going as a part of the cash lease. So maybe 30% was 30 or 40% was paid up front. I know 30 or 40% paid in the summertime, like in August when the wheat harvest had been taken to town and cashed, and then another 30 or 40%, whatever that is, left, paid in the fall after harvest and in November typically. So you can just have those as considerations and negotiation points, because I think it's important to think about. I think that would work out very nicely for you. Okay, and then irrigation equipment. If you looked at Jim's numbers and he looked at the cash rent numbers, I don't remember if Jim said it or not, but those cash rent numbers for irrigation ground assume that the landlord owned all the irrigation equipment. If the tenant owns any of the irrigation equipment, then the cash leases especially should be adjusted back a little bit, and crop share leases can be adjusted too, for that matter, so that we recognize the contribution, the investment that the tenants made into that operation. So please understand that. Fertility and manure management. So what I think about there is that we want to have a good soil in good shape, and I want us to take manure. I think that's important. I think it's important. It's a good product. There's nothing wrong with the manure product, but I think that we have to do that based on phosphorus levels in the soil, so make sure manure is being applied and managed in the proper way. Stock removal. I'm all for cattle grazing stocks. I think it's a wonderful product for cattle to use. And typically by now, most of the cattle are off of stocks because they're going to do some spring calving. And the stocks, there's not a lot of product left out there, so it's time to move cattle in for the calving, get them on calving areas, calving pastures, whatever you do in your operation. And I think the thing I worry about with stocks is that we don't go out there and bale them clean every time we have corn in that field. I think that's too hard on the phosphorus. I think that's too hard on organic matter. So the only thing I would say about stocks is just if you're having them harvested as stock bales, and that's fine, it's a good product, got to be used. It's important to use. Just make sure they don't do it every time there's corn in that field. It's take out some of the whole thing. Hunting rights, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because we're past hunting season, but just know that the hunting rights in a crop share is going to typically be shared or owned, taken by the landowner. Hunting rights in a cash lease belong to the tenant unless they're held out. Hunting rights for pasture, typically if it's a 5 or 6 month pasture lease, which is typical, then hunting rights stay with the landlord because the pasture lease ends usually either by October 1st, October 15th to November 1st. And so the hunting season doesn't start until after the lease ends. So stay with the landowner. If you can put any of that stuff in the chat or the Q&A, we'll answer that and provide more detail if there's a request for that. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. In a pasture and grazing leases usually have a 5-month lease, sometimes a 6-month lease, and those terminations not specifically required for a handshake agreement, and that LB 591 or whatever that number was doesn't address this. So because it's a lease that ends, there's no termination notice necessarily required. So be sure that you're communicating clearly on when the lease starts and when the lease ends, and make sure that they understand that if the tenant wants to lease the next year, they have to come back and ask for it again. Of course, unless there's a written lease in place that covers all these things. So please have a written lease again. It's just that important. If you got questions about that, I can provide more detail, but for right now, we're just going to keep going on. The other thing about pasture leases, and I think is really important, is that you have to address the big three. And I'll come back to that first point first, but the big three, in my view, are fire, drought, hail. And fire, drought, hail have to be addressed before the lease starts. Before the lease starts. Don't have a fire and then decide, oh, what are we going to do about the lease? Let's decide that, have that conversation before the lease starts. Now, excuse me, caught with water going down the wrong way. Now, back to the noxious weeds and brush. The general, there's no textbook or rule on this, but the general thought in Nebraska is that we have weeds should be controlled by the tenant, brush and trees should be controlled by the landlord in pastures. That's the general rule. However, Jim's right when he says whoever you can get to do it, the other party may be in charge, because sometimes the tenant has the right equipment to take care of trees and brush too. If that's happening, then the landlord should be paying that tenant to do that, or the landlord should discount the rent for the tenant doing that extra work. But typically, the weeds are controlled by the tenant, trees and brush are controlled by the landlord. And then let's see. Oh yeah, if you have the big three happen to you, fire, drought, hail, how are you going to handle the length of the lease and how are you going to handle the lease payments? To have that discussion again before any of those things happen. And I think I've covered everything that's pretty much on that slide now. Let's see. Ask good experts. So we'll just kind of push the monitor back and forth, and then we'll cover both of us if we need to. And well, I don't remember what's first here. Let's look. Is it mine? No. Yeah, when we do the leases. Okay, I already kind of talked about this, and so if there's any questions, we could do it before ahead of time. But you know, typical things in Nebraska would be the first half and November first half. That's very, very typical right now. And if you got wheat country, then it could be March 1st. I don't know about June 1st, maybe more like August 1st to 1st, but third. You can do that anytime you want to. So cash rent could be split, and I think it's very appropriate to be split, and we'll go from there.
Oh, you're fine.
Okay, all right, yeah.
My comment on the cash rent, when it comes to the cash rent, and some people don't pay any rent until the fall or whenever the crop's harvested, and that's fine. My one comment is, if you're dealing as a tenant, if you're dealing with a landlord that's retired or semi-retired and they're using that cash rent to live off of, what is the one thing they have to pay at least twice the upcoming year? Well, the one thing they have to pay is real estate taxes. I think Allan would agree a portion of the cash rent upfront when the lease is signed, especially if you're dealing with an absentee landowner, is not a bad thing. One, it shows you're good for what you're trying to do, but two, the real estate taxes have to get paid. So if you're making a retired landowner that doesn't have a lot of capital coming in from different things, this can be a very contentious point, but just be aware of it. There's many different ways to do it, and depending on the type of the crop, that can even influence it.
Grazing land leases, I don't know. I think I've heard more of that they paid all the lease up for all the grazing lease up front, but I don't know that
So-
I know I have a bigger thought on that.
And when you have grazing land, are you in ranching country? Are you in more of the meadow pasture area where I'm from? That probably influences when it gets paid. And sometimes in the ranching world, if you're, a real cattle producer, not a real, but if your major income comes when the cattle come in, well, maybe you have a portion, or maybe more of it's paid when the cattle are sold, whatever.
I just know, Jim doesn't make this comment, but I will, because I'll stick my neck out on being right or wrong. Jim, I mean, anecdotal data in my head tells me experiences I've had with Nebraska is that if you're east of a 281 or 14, Highway 14 or Highway 281 line, then the pasture rents are typically paid by the acre. If you're west of that line, then you're typically paid by the cow-calf pair. There's obviously, and this is the information I hear and see across the state. Who should pay the bill to tenant party to make repairs on the pivot? Well, it just came to me just last week. Landlord paid that bill if the tenant hires a third party. So if you had a good written lease, right? If it was a good written lease, that would be covered in a good written lease. You should have to specifically say what's going to happen there. If you have a multi-year lease, okay, So here's some other things I think about. A good written lease tells what's going to happen. Typically, in a repair situation, a tenant covers so many X number of dollars to repairs, then after that, it's kind of a deductible, if you will. And if the expenses exceed the amount that the tenant has said he'll cover each year, then the landlord steps in and helps. But in any case, if you're hiring a third party, if the tenant's hiring a third party, they should be communicating with the landlords. They're even going to do it before they incur the expense. And if they've incurred the expense already, then I don't know. I think that's bad communication. I think that needs to be addressed and fixed. Jim, what were you going to say about that?
Lease, it's important time the landlord's traveling to wherever and the tenant can't get a hold of them, and they have the ability to be putting water on, and it's 110 degrees. That's when these kind of questions get thrown at us. Just account for what you can. If the tenant has the authority to call the landlord and the tenant pays the bill, or the landlord pays the bill based on what the repair is or the amount is, just negotiate what you want to have in there. And once again, a lot of the land in Nebraska is held as absentee. And if you have a landlord that lives 200 miles away, it may not make sense for them to be the one that contacts the repair company, but just explain how it is done. Okay, if the tenant calls the pivot company or the irrigation company, they have to call the landlord or whatever.
Hopefully they didn't drop our video. Okay, we'll go from there. Should I rent my land out in a single or multi-year lease agreement? Do you want to take a stab at that, and then I'll take a stab at it?
Yeah, so when it comes to the length of the lease, we have, I got to make a correction here. This relates to the bottom part of the slide here relates to the previous question. I got to update that. But on the topic of the lease, I do single year lease, multi-year lease, whatever the case is. The length of the lease is probably going to be impacted by type of relationship. To have long-term leases, and Allan and I advocate for long-term relationships. That is perfectly fine. The question that we get into, the area that where we might have some difficulties, is adjusting that rent. So if you do a multi-year lease, make sure you have an annual provision in there. You readjust the cash rent, whether up or down. It's a two-way street. If you do a 1-year lease, the 1-year lease is going to be negotiated, and hopefully it's a long-term lease or a long-term lease with respect to the quality of the relationship. How do you want something?
It depends a little bit on whether I think the answer to this question is on the previous slide for this question. We should just switch the answers, but it depends on what investment the tenant has made into the property. In other words, there's situations where the tenant has put the pivot on for the landlord, the tenant expense. Hopefully he's getting a discount because he put it on there. It's not, the landlord should have done it, but they didn't. So then did a multi-year lease is very appropriate because tenant made investment. And I think that's what we're referring to, and we'll answer. If they've got questions, type something in. We'll answer the question here in a little bit. We're pretty close.
And when we post the slides online, the slides get corrected. I apologize for that. It always seems like there's one thing we always forget, but I think we've been pretty spot on. Continuing on, I've seen my computer pop up that we are having internet stability issues. It's the best we got right here where we're at today. So hopefully this catches everything we're talking on. On the topic of flex leases and grain prices, obviously we're much higher in grain prices and commodity prices than we were during the height of the COVID pandemic. How do you set up a flexible lease? Well, one way to address this is you have a flex lease, and a flexible lease is a form of a cash lease that you let the cash rent vary, maybe vary based on the price of corn, yield, wheat, soybeans, whatever you're raising, or the crop revenue. If you do a flex lease, make sure you have a flex lease. So under this case, okay, if the cash rent is 220 an acre, and with respect to that 220 an acre, when we see that right here, with respect to 220 an acre, that's a base cash rent. And then based on some factor, and I'll give an example here in the next slide, we're going to let that cash rent vary from the upper to the lower between 250 down to 190. Now, if the price of corn goes from $5 to $13, the maximum cash rent is going to be $250. You and the tenant and the landlord get to set that range, 190 to 250. You can go 270 down to 180, whatever you want to do. Or it's 170 if you're going 50. That's negotiable, but it's a range inside what you work. From that range, we have the breakdown here on the flexible cash leases. I set up an example based on crop revenue. Left-hand side, we have a case where the crop revenue is higher than expected. Right-hand side, we have a case where the crop revenue, it was just down just a little bit. And the reason I gave the slide this way, on the left-hand side, you're going to notice that the cash rent here, we have a situation where the corn price goes up, but the farm level yield isn't as good. On the right-hand side, you have a case where the corn price drops, but the crop revenue is better. So this just goes to show you that depending on what actually happens can definitely influence the cash rent.
I have a couple quick comments to make about flex leases. Number one, remember it's a function of risk. Remember that there's no risk to the landowner on a cash lease for production unless the check isn't good. Yeah. And on a crop share, the landowner is sharing that risk for production perfectly. So anyway, so the point is when they share, because they're sharing the crop, they accept their responsibility for the risk. And then I think the other thing to know is that when you have a flex lease, make sure you discuss ahead of time when you're going to set that lease rate. Setting the price part of it, not the rate, the price part of the equation, especially if you're using like Jim did a revenue thing here. And so just know that that setting the price has got to be agreed to ahead of time when you're going to set that price. So just understand that, and because the landlord would want to take the best price he's seen all year in October, and the tenant will want to take the lowest price he's seen all year in October. So have that discussion ahead of time. That's the other thing I suggest.
Okay. Let's see here. Hold on just a second. So now we're going to go over the questions that were submitted. The first one that's in the chat, I'll read it aloud for everyone, and you can get a shot at it. Let's say you have a property, you have a lease on. A quarter of the property is going to be built. A quarter of the property is going to be developed. Maybe you're going to build a house or a home or whatever on it. How would you address an agricultural lease if you have a property where a portion of it is going to be built upon by mid-year?
It's probably easier to go to a crop share, so you share the crop of what you actually produce. And by the way, you don't have to necessarily.
Oh, sorry about that, everybody. Looks like their audio internet must have given out. I see Jim is reconnecting here, so we'll see if we can get him back on. Again, sorry, they are in a different location today outside of their office and internet not the best. So
All right, so the question, can you hear us okay, Ryan?
yep, you're
All
back.
right, so the question Allan was talking about, how do we address a lease when we know a portion of the property is going to be built upon in the upcoming year? And one thing I would say on that point is, okay, if you have an 80, and let's say 20 acres on that, they're going to be developing into small acreage or something to that effect. If that's the case, maybe a portion of that property you just leave in grass or sow it down to oats, something you could just take it off the property and make it as a short-term crop. If the entire property is going to be planted into corn, maybe you can chop part of that for silage or something. You got to think of some type of terminal crop when you know a portion of that property is going to be disrupted. So think about what you're planting, and maybe you rent the other fourth to someone else. Maybe you rent the local 1/4 that you're going to build something on. Maybe that goes to someone that you can build something on.
Well, to finish my part of that was just say that you could go with a crop share lease and just take a smaller percentage, usually around 25 to 30% of the crop with no expenses, and then that's what you'd get for the remaining acres. That's just one idea.
Yeah. All right. Next question. I apologize for our internet. It worked really good for, at least we got through our main slides. So next question we had come in, we're just going to do these in order. Next question we have here is, how do you, if you have a situation where the tenant owns the pivot, the pump, and the power unit, they own the well on a neighboring property, how do you adjust the cash rent to account for that? I'll take my stab at it and let Allan. My comment is, in 2018, when we asked this survey question, we found that you take off somewhere between 30 to 50 bucks an acre when you account for both the pivot. You're somewhere in that 30, 35 an acre. The power unit, you're talking diesel engine, electric motor, maybe 10 to 15. Now that well below the ground, if they own the below ground improvements as well, maybe their pivot swings onto the neighboring 80 or whatever. I don't have a good feel on that. I would estimate you might be in a case where, yes, if you own the property, you are still getting taxed at an irrigated rate. But keep in mind, the discount would probably be a fairly healthy number, because basically the tenant's taking care of everything except the land in terms of the improvements.
So as I understand this, the tenant's providing all the equipment to irrigate the ground, and the landlord has the ground. And so what I would do is just look at the dry land rate, because that's all the landlord has is the dry land ground. And the tenants should get all the reward for putting all that investment in. The bottom line is and then Jim's right, the dry land, the ground will now get taxed as irrigated ground if it's irrigated. So it should be dry land rent plus whatever taxes went up. And it could be a good dry land rent. It doesn't have to be average. It could be high dry land rent plus whatever taxes went up. That way to get started without a whole bunch of calculations. A nice place to start from anyway.
All right.
Thoughts on leasing for.
Next question we have here, Allan, this was addressed to you. What are your thoughts on leasing pasture for longer periods? For example, let's say a 3 to 5 year period instead of just a summer,
If whatever the landlord and tenant agreed to is more important than anything I got to say about it. And if they agree that the longer lease is appropriate, that especially if the tenant has to put a bunch of work into fence or something like that, or crossing, I think a longer lease is very appropriate. So if they agree to something, I think it's awesome.
My only comment, I have no problem with long-term leases. Just make sure you have a provision in there where you renegotiate the rent. I have absolutely no idea what beef prices are going to be for this year, yet alone 5 years from now. So just make sure you adjust those annually to account for the differences in profitability related to whatever, whether it's cropland, grazing land, whatever. All right, next question we asked, how much of a discount should you take off the irrigated cash rent if the farmer owns a pivot on my property?
Answer that.
We already mentioned it, but I'll say it again. In 2018, when we did this survey question, We found on the survey, and I would say based on my call volume, a discount kind of in that 30 to 35 an acre range seems to be pretty common when the tenant provides the pivot. But if the landlord owned everything else, the power unit, the pump, everything else. We're updating this for 23. I'm sure this will be appearing in our summer webinar if you keep following this series. So stay tuned.
Well, and my only comment is it kind of depends on how old the pivot is or how new the pivot is. And some of these brand new pivots would probably be more than $35 an acre. But if it's older pivot, maybe 30, 35 would be perfectly fine. And that's what Jim's survey showed. So that's good.
All right, next question we got here. We'll just keep going until we hit 12 o'clock and hopefully the internet, I know our video is off, at least it sounds good on your end. So we had a question come in here, basically something to the effect, we have a person finishing up with a 5-year lease and they had a set cash rent, the way I'm interpreting this question, they had a set cash rent, I believe, over that 5-year period. And to bring up the point that there's been exceptional inflation, something like 20% over the last 5 years or whatever the number is, it's been exceptional in the last year or so. With that being said, if we're going to reestablish a new lease, is it reasonable or fair to use the same price as they had been using and then just tack on the rate of inflation now? What do you say?
Oh, you're sticking me with that? You're the expert on this. You're the one who talks about real estate taxes. You know, it kind of depends on where you started. I mean, you're trying to establish what you consider to be an equitable lease. And so to me, it depends more on what the productive ground is than it depends on where you're at. I mean, it kind of depends on where you started and where you're at and what's going on. I think that we have to be a little careful about that. So I hate to give an answer on that. Yeah, some level of increase is absolutely appropriate. Should it be the full 20% or whatever that inflation rate is? I'm not sure about that. I'd have to know where you're at and kind of know what your productivity is first.
My comment on inflation is guided by some of the federal policies that have been implemented to whether federal spending or some of the things the Federal Reserve had did during COVID to drive interest rates down and stimulate the economy. This was no fault of any particular tenant, any farmer, rancher across Nebraska. The thing I would tell you to review when we talked about the cash equivalent from crop share, sit down with the tenant. This individual doesn't have to tell you what's in their bank account. They don't even have to tell you what type of corn they're planting. Can they give you, if you were on a 50-50 share, you get half the yield. If you knew what the price of corn or what a reasonable price for corn would be over the length of that lease, which is not an easy question to answer, how much would you stand to make per acre when it came to a crop share, given all the things, all the attributes of the property in that? That is one way to recalibrate that cash rent. I wish Allan would say this too. We wish our annual salary would increase in accordance to the rate of inflation, but that is, Allan's laughing when I say that, but our annual salary adjustments are not connected in our particular position to the rate of inflation. Some unionized jobs might be, we're not. So what I'm getting at is you have to look at the actual productivity of what do you have and how, what are its systems.
Yeah, I think our last 3 years are 0, 1.5, and 3. So I wouldn't say that we're getting rich on this job. Okay, how's the landowner real estate tax viewed? Seems like it should go towards his cost share.
All right, so I think the question that we have here, the very basic example I gave, I said, okay, let's do cash equivalent from crop share. And the question the person is addressing here is how do you address the real estate taxes in that, I believe, in the example of the cash equivalent from crop share? Well, I do not account for the real estate taxes and the cash equivalent from crop share because if you're getting cash rent, you're still paying real estate taxes. If you're doing a crop share, you still get to pay. Yes, you do have to pay that expense. Also, in the cash equivalent from crop share, I did not account for the tenant's time, equipment with respect to planting, harvesting, whatever the case might be. Some of the other smaller inputs besides the big three. Think of a crop share as a balancing act. If you remember that old show Law and Order where you had Lady Justice holding the scales of justice, think of the contributions of both parties. And that's a big question to answer, but that's a good point they brought up.
Well, but the point would be the tenant's expenses have gone crazy. Most fertilizer prices have doubled or tripled the last year, and all repair prices have doubled the last year. So I think we have to be a little careful about how we handle that.
All right, the next question we have here. We have rented some, they have a variety of cropland and pasture, a young couple at a reduced rate to help them get started. It's now been about 4 years since they've started engaging in this lease. And they feel, individual, I believe this would probably be the landlord, probably feels that they have a fairly good start. We now feel that they're becoming dependent on those low rents. Two of the couples are relatives. So basically you have a situation here where you're renting to a beginning farmer operation. You give them a break on the cash rent, let's say for 4 or 5 years. These farmers or even family members, so conversations get a little bit more passionate or heated at times. With that being said, is it time, Al, as you're the farm transition beginning farmer person here, is it time that we charge more of a market going rent if we've been giving them a discounted rent for the last several years?
Or they also suggested that we bring this up a little bit at a time, and I'd probably go for the little bit at a time thing personally, especially when you talk about relatives. But yeah, it's appropriate to start cutting them off the charity, if you will. It's not really charity, but you follow where I'm going with that. You're giving them a discount. Now it's probably time to get rid of some of those discounts, but I'd probably do it a little at a time instead of saying just deal with it. So that'd be my advice. But again, whatever the landlord and the tenant agree to is more important than anything I've got to say about it. So just have that discussion, and you start by saying, hey, it's time we start thinking about what we're going to do here.
Yep. All right. I got
Last one here.
I'll answer the last question. I want to hit the last 2 or 3 slides. I know some people start dropping off after noon here.
Okay.
One thing to point out, Allan and myself, we're going to be doing a virtual landlord tenant cash rent workshop. So if you've been unable to join us in person, I strongly encourage you to sign up. Details are going to be coming on the CAP website. If you sign up for this meeting, it's going to be a little bit longer webinar. We will be sending you actual handouts in the mail. And I believe these are the correct times. Double check the website. The first day, we're going to kind of do an eastern half of Nebraska focus. The following day, we're going to do the western half. If you can't make it the one day, but the other one, even if your farm is in the east or whatever, we're still covering all the information for the entire state. We're just going to try to give examples that are maybe more relevant to a certain area of the state. I want to thank Aiden. He's been a great help with the expenses that we're incurring today with our real estate work here at the university. Be sure to reach out to him if you have any questions. And if you're a land, please consider, if you like sponsoring these things, we're always looking for help. And if you'd like to help out with the real estate survey, the NU Foundation has a link. You can take a look at this link right here. It's the go.unl.edu/landfund. Every dollar that goes into this fund helps support our mailing and survey printing and survey expenses with annual farm real estate report. And our next land management quarterly, the topics we have right here, and we're taking a look at the 23 cash rents. A lot of finances occurring. Allan's going to be.
Okay, sorry, we almost made it to the end. Now Jim's back on. So Jim, can you hear me?
Well, we still have Ryan. Just give us 1 second here. A few more questions here. And I think we're still, hopefully still live. We're missing a few people. Let's see here. I don't know. If you guys can hear us, we'll cover this one last question. How do you set a cash rent for a pasture that includes maybe some small barns, a fenced-in shelter, hold livestock, and maybe a well to pump livestock, water for the livestock?
You want me to go first? Sure. So I think I'd probably do that as two different transactions. I'd probably rent a pasture for one rate, and then you can set a rate for the buildings in your yard and the water and that sort of thing. I'd make that a separate rate. I know that's a little more calculation to cover, but you have to really kind of handle that as two different transactions. So
All right, looks like we lost their audio. So Jim and Allan, if you can hear me, we don't have your audio anymore as you're trying to answer this last question. So we apologize again for the connection issues there on their end, but hopefully you're able to hear most of the relevant information. If they're not able to get back on here, I'll just remind you that the recording of this webinar will be available along with the slides. That will be on our Center for Ag Profitability website. If you go to cap.unl.edu, cap.unl.edu. On the webinar page there, which is pretty easy to find, there's an archive of all past recordings. So I'll give it another moment here and see if Jim and Allan can reconnect to finish that last thought. But if not, we want to thank you very much for joining us, and do stay tuned to cap.unl.edu for a full schedule of more upcoming webinars. We'll be back on March 2nd with our regular Thursday series talking about FSA disaster programs, which are available here in Nebraska. So with that and not seeing them able to reconnect, we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar right now since we're past noon central. But once again, thank you for joining us. If you do have questions, you can reach out to either Jim or Allan. You can find their contact information on our website as well, cap.unl.edu. So with that, thank you very much for joining us, and hope you have a good afternoon.